thanks, Daryl. It's nice to be here today. I'm glad you didn't schedule this tomorrow. And I'm actually surprised there are so many of you here because as Iowans, what we normally do right before a blizzard is we go to the grocery store. That's where everybody's at. You've already been there. Yeah.
I was there this afternoon, and you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, I'm the Bluffland Program Manager. I work out of my home in Decorah. And I've been with the foundation, like Daryl said, about 9 years, so since 2005. And when I started with the foundation, I was working statewide, doing permanent land protection and land stewardship work. In 2011, I had the opportunity to move to Decorah with my family and concentrate my protection and stewardship efforts on what we call the Blufflands region, and I'll kind of show you what we define that as a little bit later on. So anyway, so just show of hands here. How many people are pretty familiar with the foundation? Okay, a few aren't. So I do have some slides in the beginning here where I talk a little bit about who the foundation is, and what we do. And so I'll go through that pretty quick, and then I'll try and concentrate most of our time on Blufflands work. And I'm going to go fast. I have a lot of slides, and but we'll leave time at the end for questions. So see if we can figure this thing out. Okay. So I'm just going to call us the foundation from here on out because it's a really long name. But we're a statewide private nonprofit conservation organization or a land trust. And our mission is, we were established in 1979, so about 35 years now. And our mission is to protect and restore Iowa's land, water, and wildlife for those who follow or for future generations. The only way we're able to meet that mission is through partnerships, whether that's with other nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy, public agencies like county conservation boards, Iowa DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and probably most important here in Iowa is private landowners. If we did not have the ability to work with private landowners, we wouldn't get nearly as much protection done as we have. With the help of those partners, we've been able to protect over 140,000 acres around the state. And that took over 1,000 individual land projects or land transactions. Often get asked, well, where's your funding come from? The vast majority of it is private funding. We have nearly 7,000 very loyal and generous members. And their annual memberships is what really keeps the foundation going. But we receive other donations from private individuals in the form of cash, sometimes land. We get corporate donations, bequest, so people may leave land or money in their will to the foundation. And then just over time, we've been able to build up an endowment. And each year we just draw a certain percentage off of that to just help us continue to do our conservation work. Okay, so what is it that we do? It's pretty diverse, and there's probably more to it than what most people realize, but at the core of our mission is permanent land protection. And we kind of break that down into three primary areas. Working with private landowners to help them protect their land, and we'll talk about some tools we use. Helping public agencies acquire land. We do a lot of that. And in fact, that was one of the main reasons the foundation was started. Was to help public agencies buy land. So we're essentially an interim buyer for them. So they maybe identify a property that's for sale, they want to own and manage it, make it available to the public, but either they can't meet the seller's timeline or they don't have the funds on hand. Luckily, we have really good borrowing capacity, and so we can work with that landowner and try and acquire it and then hold it until the public agency can buy it from us. And then we own and manage land around the state that we consider that permanently protected as well. Oh, sorry. Land stewardship or land restoration, land management, whatever you want to call it, big part of what we do. And we have several staff that focus most of their time on land management work, and we'll talk about that soon. There's an educational component to really everything we do, but I think the cornerstone of our education program is really our internship programs. We have a design intern, a grant writing intern, a legal intern, trail interns. I'm forgetting one. And then land stewardship interns, which I'm most familiar with. But we've helped train 255 college students as interns since we started those programs. So we're pretty proud of that. We have a couple staff that work on conservation policy at the state and federal level, and then a couple individuals that work with public agencies to acquire trail corridors. Okay, so that's kind of who we are and what we do in a nutshell. But I often get asked, what do you guys protect? And oftentimes they hear Iowa, they think, well, you're protecting agricultural land. Not necessarily. Our mission is really around natural communities. We occasionally do protect agricultural land that's associated with it, but it's natural communities that we're really focusing on. So things like remnant prairie, oak savanna, woodlands, wetlands, rivers and streams, and here is where we have done that protection. All those little green dots or blobs are individual land projects that we've helped with, and the orange lines obviously are trails. So we do work statewide wherever there's good conservation to be done. We'll work with our partners to do that. Okay, so now let's focus in a little bit more on what we're talking about today, the Blufflands region. And this is what we kind of loosely call the Blufflands region. It's about 7 counties in northeastern Iowa. And if you think about the Paleozoic Plateau landform, and then kind of, there's a, right here, the east central Iowa Drift Plain, it kind of captures most of those landforms. So this is the part of northeast Iowa that's really dissected and rugged. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so I showed you on a statewide basis what we're really interested in protecting, but in the Blufflands region, let's look at what we're really kind of looking at to protect. Upper Mississippi River bluffs, it's pretty much a no-brainer. It's critical for a wildlife corridor. The scenic beauty is, knocks your socks off. So very interested in that. Here's another photo of a bluff. This is along the Mississippi River. This is actually a private property that we hold a conservation easement on. Again, wildlife habitat, scenic beauty. This place has timber rattlesnakes on it. The bluff there is the last place that peregrine falcons nested in the wild. So it has some significance from that standpoint. A lot of archaeological resources, cultural resources. I mean, this place just kind of captures everything we want to protect in the Blufflands region, minus trout streams. Relatively large intact forests, as far as we can have those in Iowa. Northeast Iowa has quite a bit of that, and we're interested in protecting that. Upper Iowa River, for all the great reasons you guys already know, but the scenic beauty, the wildlife habitat, the recreational values, cold water trout streams. It adds so much to the diversity of Northeast Iowa. And of course, recreational opportunities. This is the picture on the poster, but hill prairies, or goat prairies, bluff prairies, whatever you want to call them. They used to be very common in the Blufflands region, and now you see fewer and fewer, it seems like daily, because of eastern red cedar infestation. Then you have neat things because of the karst topography. You have a lot of caves, you have springs just bubbling up everywhere, and waterfalls, and cold air slopes or algific talus slopes, which most of you know have a unique plant and animal assemblage with them. And you get to find cool things like northern monkshood, which is a federally threatened species. And then, wow, that's a really dark photo. So there are all those, I'll just call them habitat types that we're interested in seeing protected, but the location of them is really important too. So this hill in the background there, this right here, that was all in one ownership. The town of New Albin is right there. This is the Mississippi River National Scenic Byway. So this property was platted for a subdivision. There's a road already built up the hill. They cleared lots. I mean, you can see up on that point right there how they cleared those trees off. That was like the best lot ever. You can see everything from there. It's gorgeous. But it was really poor timing for the development. The economy crashed. It was good timing for us. We had a grant, and we were able to buy a conservation easement on this property that will limit it to one house instead of 20-some, and that one house will be right here in the valley, not up on the bluff. But timber rattlesnakes on the hill prairie here, good wildlife habitat, water quality, scenic, all those things. So these habitats along the National Scenic Byway are something we're really interested in seeing protected too.
Is that looking north?
What's that?
North? Is that looking north?
Yeah, kind of northwest. Yep. Okay, so that's what we're really kind of trying to target. But you know, what protection tools do we use? And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, and this is just kind of part of the list. These are kind of the most common ones you see. The first three are pretty straightforward. A fair market value sale. You know, a landowner says, I want to sell my property for appraised value. Will you buy it? You buy it, and it's owned by a conservation organization. It's protected. Bargain sale, not much different, except they're donating part of the value. That makes it easier for the conservation organization to protect it because none of us are flush with money. Outright donations of the land. Some landowners can afford to do that, and it's actually more common than a person would think. Bequest. So maybe you can't afford to sell or donate your land during your lifetime, but you can leave it in your will to a conservation organization. Reserve life estate. This is one that's become very popular, and we've worked with many landowners on this. It's a great tool. So what happens in a reserve life estate, the landowner actually transfers ownership of the property to a conservation organization. But they still live on the land, they still take income off of it, they still pay property taxes, they get to enjoy the land for the rest of their lives. But as soon as they pass away, all the rights go to the conservation organization. And so it's great because they get to enjoy it, they get tax benefits for doing this because they made the donation during their lifetime, and they have peace of mind. If they really want to know that their land is going to go to a conservation organization, it's done because it's already been transferred to them. So, great tool. And then conservation easements. I'm going to touch on these a little bit more because it's a very popular tool. It's a great form of protection, and most people don't understand what they are, or they know a little bit, just enough to be dangerous and call them bad things. So, so essentially a conservation easement, it's a legal, voluntary, perpetual agreement between a landowner and a conservation organization where the landowner restricts certain uses of the property like mining, development, maybe row crop agriculture in places to protect certain conservation values like wildlife habitat, open space, scenic beauty, water quality. And they still retain ownership of the property. They still pay property taxes. They still get any income off of the land. There's no public access unless they want that. They can still sell the land. They can give it away. They can leave it in the will to their children. But the easement stays with the land forever. No matter who owns it in the future, they have to abide by the same terms that these original landowners put on the property. So it really is an effective and very strong form of protection. You really can't undo these easements. Okay, I just want to use this as an example of how different forms of protection can help you protect a larger, significant natural resource area. So this is the Upper Iowa River between Kendallville and Bluffton. I'm sure many of you have been on this section of the Upper Iowa River. Absolutely gorgeous. All sorts of wonderful things we could say about it. What's in green is public land. Most of that's owned by DNR. What's in yellow is private land that's protected. And most of that land in yellow, and I need to update this because there's more yellow on it as of last year, is some of it's owned by the foundation, but most of it's privately owned, and protected with a conservation easement or some form of an easement. So there are federal easement programs out there like farm and ranch land protection, emergency watershed protection programs, forest legacy. The whole point is by having multiple protection tools available to us, or available to the landowner really, we're able to protect a much larger portion of an important area. So, I mean, just think about it. If the only way you could protect land was public ownership, look how much land would not be protected in this area. Okay, focusing on protection in this Blufflands region, you saw that map earlier. I guess I just wanted to start out by saying, you know, since we started, so for 35 years, this area has always been a priority for the foundation. I mean, if you're going to do conservation work, you got to do it in Northeast Iowa. I mean, relatively speaking, there are very abundant resources. Because of that, we've had a staff person since, I believe, 1995 that has always focused their time doing protection work there. So in this region, we've protected over 21,500 acres, 175 projects to make that happen. 70 of those projects are conservation easements. And I think we hold 120 conservation easements around the state, so over half of them are up here. So it's been a very popular tool. Okay, I can't talk about protection in the Blufflands without talking about the Blufflands Alliance group. And I'm going to be brief about this. We could talk a long time about this group, but essentially this group was started in 1994, and it's made up of 6 land trusts. We're one of those land trusts. The other ones are from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And all those land trusts have the upper Mississippi River and closely related areas as a high priority for protection. But we felt that if we came together and worked together, planned together, went after larger grants, we could get more done. And so that's what happened. And the McKnight Foundation really liked the idea. And for 18 years, they funded the Blufflands Alliance, which is unheard of for a foundation to fund somebody for 18 years. And they gave over $7 million to that group. So each individual land trust got a portion of that, and they used it for operating expenses. So to help pay for like part of my time and to help pay for doing grant administration and all sorts of things. And some of it actually went toward land acquisition and purchasing conservation easements. So the whole idea was to plan together but work individually. We didn't compete with each other for the money. We agreed up front. This is how much everybody's going to get of the piece of the pie. And so it was very effective because we weren't competitive for it. So great model. And those 6 land trusts during that 18-year period protected over 50,000 acres. And this is where that protection happened in the 4 states during that period. Okay, let's shift gears over to restoration. And I need a drink.
Want me to warm that up for you?
Yeah, please. No, I'm kidding. I actually thought you were kidding. Okay, so restoration. I often get asked, why are you guys managing this property this way? You know, what are you doing? Are you managing for, you know, pre-settlement conditions? Are you managing for white-tailed deer? What are you doing? Well, those are really good questions, and sometimes I wonder, yeah, what am I managing for? And but I was trying to think, what would my restoration philosophy be if I could just wrap it up in one sentence? And this is what I came up with, and I don't think I still understand it, but maintain and enhance the health, function, structure, and native diversity of our natural communities. We could talk about this for hours, and I bet we'd have some arguments over what it means. But that's kind of what I use as a rough framework to guide our management on our properties. Those are some of the things I'm thinking about. So, but when you look at what are we actually doing out on the land when we're doing restoration, here are some of the things. Doing inventory work. We don't do it on all of our properties. I wish we could. but we don't. Some properties we have a ton of information, other ones we have very little. But it's important to help us figure out how we maybe want to manage the site. Invasive species, we spend so much time on invasive species. It's one of the most important things I think we do. Most of Iowa's natural communities formed under some kind of fire regime, so prescribed fire is a big part of what we do. Restoring hydrology, maybe not so much in the Blufflands region, but in north central Iowa, northwest Iowa, there's quite a bit of that we help partners do wetland restoration work. Grazing and haying, I probably shouldn't even have thrown it in here because we've done very little of this. We've done some in north central Iowa and some in southern Iowa, mostly to control things like smooth brome or fescue, but we haven't done that much of it, and we probably should do a little more. Reconstructions, what I mean by that, most of you obviously know, but essentially what I mean by that is we're taking row crop land and planting it to prairie or planting it to, I say woodlands very loosely because it's mostly planting trees and maybe a little bit of herbaceous cover, and hopefully someday it functions somewhat like a woodland. And then the last one, thinning, oak woodlands, oak savanna. We spend a lot of time working on that. And most of those areas are so overgrown, they're not healthy, and for a variety of reasons that most of you already know why they're that way. Okay, let's look at some photos here. First thing I talked about was inventory. Some of that inventory work we do ourselves, but there are some things we obviously don't know, and if we can get experts on certain taxa out there, we'll try and get them there. Sometimes we hold events like bio blitzes to help us gather that inventory data. So here's a group of folks on a hill prairie. I think they're actually birders. They almost all have binoculars on, but they're looking at plants right now. But we actually get birding groups like the Iowa Ornithologists Union, Iowa Prairie Network, Native Plant Society, different groups like that. They're willing to come out and do field trips and collect data for you. And it's important. Okay, so here are some of the things that we find. I just wanted to throw some neat pictures in here because I know all we're going to be looking at tomorrow is snow. So hopefully these things will be popping up in the next month. But pasque flowers, cylindrical blazing star. I think this is such a cool plant, and we have one property that's just thick on it. Western sunflower. For some reason, I think that's a really neat plant too, up on the hill prairies. And then we find stuff we don't like too, like garlic mustard, but that's part of it. And we find cute and cuddly things, some not so cute and cuddly, but really cool. Timber rattlesnakes. There's some really healthy populations in the Blufflands region yet. And yes, I'm afraid of them, but I respect them. I think they're really neat. I think they add to the sense of wildness to our landscape. When you have something like that, it can hurt you if it gets you. So I think they're neat. You find all sorts of bird data, neat birds like scarlet tanagers that are, relatively common. But then you find something like this. That's a nesting cerulean warbler. And you think, awesome, we have a cerulean warbler. Their populations are plummeting, and we've got them on our property. And actually, we heard 8 singing males. That's wonderful. Then you realize, oh my gosh, we can't mess up in our management and have these things gone. So it can be somewhat of a burden, too, to know what you really have. But it's important.
Burden?
What's that? A burden. Yeah. Maybe I could pick a better word, but sometimes it feels that way. But then insects. I mean, everybody knows insects are really in the spotlight now, as they should be. We know hardly anything about them. I personally don't know boo about insects. I need to know more. But, you find things that are relatively abundant and common, like a great spangled fritillary here. And then you may find something like this on your property. I'm not going to tell you the scientific name because I'll butcher it. But basically, it's a bald-nosed hopper is what they call it. This was found on a hill prairie during a bio blitz. It was the first one found in Iowa. And at that time, there were only 20 locations in the country where it had ever been found. and it was found on hill prairies that did not have a recent history of fire. And here I am thinking we need to burn that hill prairie. And so anyway, since then, Mary Jane Hatfield is the one that found this. She was on a mission to find it in other places, and she found it on some other hill prairies in northeast Iowa, and she actually found it in the Les Hills now. So it may be more common than we think, but we still know this is a species that's probably really sensitive to fire, and so we have to be careful in our management.
That's magnified by quite a bit, too.
I've seen one. It's tiny. Yeah. Okay, so then this is what we do after we get all the inventory information. This is the only photo I could find where people are standing around looking at each other, but that's kind of what we do. It's like, okay, now what? And so, you come up with a rough plan. Sometimes it's on paper, sometimes it's just in our heads what we're going to do. And then you think, oh yeah, it's expensive to do land restoration. And this is what we want to do, but how do we really get there? And so as a land trust, we're a private landowner. We're not a public agency, so we are eligible for many of the cost share programs that every other private landowner is. And don't you love how our field is full of acronyms? Is every field that way? But we utilize CRP, EWPP, Emergency Watershed Protection Program. That's an easement program, but they help pay for the restoration. EQIP and WIP, those are NRC, Natural Resource Conservation Service programs where they'll help you do wildlife habitat work and water quality work. State Wildlife Grant, that's a DNR program. We're getting cost share from them right now to do different things. NIFWIF, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then we get grants from other foundations and groups. And then finally, private funding sources, especially with our intern programs, our land stewardship intern programs in particular. We have some private individuals that just love that we're helping college students be out on the land, learn something, and do good things. And they will open their wallet. And so we're very, very fortunate to have people like that. So that leads into, how do you get the work done? And we lean very heavily on our land stewardship interns. A lot of the work gets done during the summer when they're available. And here's a group of them here on a hill prairie. This is actually the same hill prairie that's on the poster, just a different angle. But we have two intern crews. The statewide crew, we've had them since 2006. They travel the entire state, work on land we own, and then private land that we have protected with conservation easements. And most of their work is invasive species oriented. Because of the abundant amount of land and resources in northeast Iowa, last year we started a Blufflands crew as well. And we hired 3 interns last year to focus on that area. And so they worked on, I think, 13 different properties last summer. And again, mostly invasive species work. So in addition to our interns here, I think there are 3 Luther College interns in here. And so we'll work with other groups as well. And in fact, I don't remember which year it was, but there were some folks from here that came up and helped us at Heritage Valley take cedar trees off. And I looked for a photo and I can't find one. So if you guys have one, send it to me. But it's just wonderful to work with different groups. We work with the Nature Conservancy interns and others. But they help get the work done. We've hired AmeriCorps crews, Conservation Corps of Iowa crews to help get some of this work done. And as dirty and grimy and as sweaty as they are, they're all smiling. They love this work. And then volunteers. Last year we made a real concerted effort to start a new volunteer program and just to try and make it the best volunteer program we can. And so this is a group that helped do some garlic mustard removal on a property, and it was a lot of fun. We're looking at growing this program even more. And I had to throw in this picture of Dennis. This is a retired school teacher outside of Decorah that comes out and helps me a lot. and I really appreciate this man, and he's collecting some seed for us there. And then I had to throw the picture in of the 3 Bluffland interns. These 3 students, they're all from Luther, just excellent young adults, and they did a great job. So, all right, so some of the things they're doing, I talked about invasive species control. So garlic mustard pulling, we saw them doing this a lot early on. We get later into summer, we do a lot of sweet clover, wild parsnip, maybe a little bit of thistles, but mostly sweet clover and wild parsnip pulling or digging out of our reconstructed prairies or even on remnant prairies. And some people will tell me, you're never going to win that battle, and I'd say, yes, we can, because we've done it before. But it takes a lot of effort, and you have to be very consistent with it, but it can be done. And then hill prairie management. The interns do a lot of work on this. And so you can see, I mean, there's stumps everywhere up here. I mean, basically it looked like this. There's prairie underneath there. And we don't own a tractor, but the neighbor did, and he actually let us borrow it. And he has a bulldozer too, and he dug a big hole on his property. And so we took all the cedars off this hill, drug them over there. He pushed them in with the dozer, and we had the biggest fire I've ever seen in my life. It was really neat. Anyway, this is that prairie, and the tractor was sitting just down the road here. This was before they did any clearing. This was 2010. Here it is in 2013. Wow. And the prairie's in there. You would walk in there and you'd see prairie plants. If there was an opening, it was really good prairie. Where it wasn't open, you'd see these very, very sick-looking plants. But it's still recovering. It's pretty weedy. That's probably a lot to do with the disturbance of pulling the trees off that slope. But anyway, this makes the interns smile when they do stuff like this. We did oak woodland thinning project this last summer. And essentially what we were trying to do is kind of an oak hickory dominated ridge in this woodland, and there were getting to be a lot of fire intolerant and shade tolerant trees in there. And so we went in there and we were trying to clear those out, try and get more sunlight to the herbaceous layer, and make it a little healthier system. Here's a before photo. Unfortunately, my after photo was weeks later, and it looks more dramatic than it was. But we really did thin this out, and there are lots of little tiny piles of trees throughout this area. And we're going to bring fire in here to try and help restore this area. But that was just kind of a first step. Okay, so fire. We'll never put fire back on the landscape the way it used to work. I mean, we don't even know how it used to work, but we know it was there. Maybe Daryl knows, but I don't. But, we use it as a tool, obviously, and it's a very effective tool. We use it to modify, the structure, composition, control invasive species, stimulate the herbaceous layer, all these things. But in the Blufflands region, most of our fire has been on hill prairies, like this one here. And this is not funny camera effects. This is a really steep hill. And burning on these hill prairies is fun, but it's more fun when it's over. But this is the hill prairie we were burning on. And this is where that ball-nosed hopper, that little tiny insect, was found, was on this hill prairie. So what we decided was we were going to try and just burn no more than a third of this prairie. And I don't know if that's what we accomplished. I've never measured it out. The prairie goes way up here, but I think we were close. And so it's so much easier to burn the whole thing. You just walk along the bottom of it with a drip torch and it runs to the top and you're done. This is dangerous, but it's worth it. And so that's what we try and do. And that's some of the results we hope to get. Scorch those cedar trees and kill them. If we can't cut them off, like this site is extremely steep, and we got a very hot fire on it. In fact, the next day they had a burn ban on. And but
is
this,
that Heritage Valley?
Yeah, this is way over on the west side, and I think water burned that day. It was dry, and it was a very effective fire. But we use fire in woodlands too, and this is just one example. But you can see there's a pretty dense shrub layer in here, and most of this was native. It was prickly ash, but it was just getting really dense, and the herbaceous layer was getting weak. It was getting thin. You were starting to see a lot of soil, and so we ran a fire through here in the spring, and you can see it was pretty effective in top killing that shrub layer. It's obviously going to grow back, but if we keep hitting it with fire occasionally, we're gonna make a difference. Okay, what I'm going to finish up with is reconstructions. I just want to give you a quick example of an idea of what we've done there. So this is that Heritage Valley property up in Alameda County that I've referred to. It's about 1,200 acres. The foundation purchased in 2007. There's about 3 miles of the Upper Iowa River that flow through there. All the light colored areas, this is a ridge top, this is a ridge top. These are 2 little fields in this great big woodland. They're up on top. And then all of this is floodplain. When we acquired this property, we thought, man, there's only 300 acres of row crop on this 1,200 acre property. 300 acres is still a lot, but relatively speaking, it's not much. And here would be an opportunity where we could create 1,200 acres of contiguous habitat. And so all those programs that I mentioned, and protection tools and restoration tools, we tried to tap into as many as we could. And the only thing that's left in row crop right now is like from right here over here, this area here. Everything else has been planted to prairie or trees. Again, hoping it'll be woodland someday. And there was all sorts of thought and turmoil into figuring out what do you plant where. But the inventory data we had helped immensely. We looked at soils data, we looked at historical notes, talked to a lot of wildlife professionals, and the answer I got most of the time was, it doesn't matter if you plant it to trees or prairie, just get it out of row crop. And so that made me sleep a little better at night. But essentially what we did, the ridge top up here, we planted that to prairie. We planted some prairie over here. We planted prairie down here. This is in the floodplain, but it is just pure sand, and it's right next to a hill prairie we've done a lot of restoration on. And this floodplain, we planted almost entirely to trees. And this to trees, that makes sense. And then this little area we planted to trees too. And a lot of that had to do with some of the species we saw. That we had a lot of forest interior bird species here, so we're trying to reduce the edge, get bigger blocks of woodland. So here's one of the prairie plantings up on the ridge top. Pretty young planting here. It's in the fall. It doesn't look very impressive at all, but it was a pretty diverse mix when we put it in, so we'll see how it turns out. But we had bobolinks and dick sissels on here last year, and so I mean it's working. Here is a photo when that floodplain was being farmed. This was probably 2006, 2007 maybe, right before we bought it. Yeah, before 2008, exactly. So you can see right here, however you want to look at it, either the corn is going into the river or the river is going into the corn. But it's bad what's happening there. And so here's that hill prairie that we burned an angle on right here. So the next photos were standing right here looking back toward the plain. That's what happened to that floodplain in 2008. Again, record flood, shouldn't happen very often. I don't know if they said that was a 500-year flood or whatever, but 2013, not quite as bad. But I took this photo after it had probably gone down at least a foot. It looked worse. And this is the kind of damage we were seeing. Not from the flood last summer, but the 2008 flood. There was a lot of this on that property. And this isn't good for the river, it's not good for aquatic life, it's not good for anything. And we said, okay, all that bottomlands, it's going into trees. And the reason we picked trees is multiple reasons, because of the inventory, but also because of the frequent flooding. We're seeing reed canary grass in that floodplain like crazy now. There are willows and cottonwoods and box elders just coming up by the millions. If we would have planted that to prairie, we would have spent all of our time trying to manage a planted prairie versus the remnants.
Why would
You know,
want to plant
and-
a prairie on a floodplain anyway?
What's that?
Why would you want to plant a prairie on a floodplain anyway?
Historically speaking, this floodplain was probably prairie. From historical notes, from historical surveyor notes, this property is in western Alameda County. As you start moving east along the Upper Iowa River in Alameda County, the river starts to get more and more of a floodplain. It's more open. It isn't really tight. And everything I've heard is that it was probably prairie. At least, when it was maybe drier, Native Americans were burning a lot. I don't know. But, I had people telling me, no, you should be planting prairie. And I said, no, I'm not going to, because I don't think I can keep it prairie forever. So anyway, that was the choice we made. I hope it was a good decision. These are some of the tough decisions we have to make. So here's a photo of the property. I think that was last year, but the majority of it was planted to trees. We actually planted trees on this area and all of this back here in 2008, and 3 weeks later we had that historical flood, so it was bad. Anyway, and then this is just a photo of that floodplain from last summer and all the tree shelters. And anyway, I guess that's kind of what I have. That's a lot of what we do, and so anyway, questions? I'm hoarse.
Pretty fast. Are you working in that sand cove area where they want to do the fracking? Or mine the sand for the fracking?
There's one individual that's contacted us about maybe doing a conservation easement, and there's actually a property we're looking at acquiring there that the DNR is interested in. And I've actually talked to one other individual up there, but we haven't been out actively pushing easements. Maybe we should, but there are a lot of folks that I'm hearing they want purchase conservation easements. They don't want to donate, and that's fine, because maybe they can't afford to do that, but we can't afford to buy all those easements either. But yeah, the frac sand mining is a really important issue, and I don't know what's going to happen yet, but I think there's a lot of protection that could happen there and save a lot of really great resources. So
I guess I worry about it'll be like hoglots, that the state will, you know what I mean, that it'll go out of local control.
Yep.
Not in Winship County anymore, and somebody else will be making decisions. And
Yep.
that scares me.
Yep. Well, luckily there are, Winneshiek County and Alameda County, they both have protector groups of local citizens that have been working very hard to try and, fight this or stop it, or encourage people to get more educated about it before they allow it to happen. So
They seem to have gotten out ahead of the thing
Yes.
a little bit based on Wisconsin's experience. I think.
Right. Yeah. But I think it kind of caught people off guard. People knew it was happening in Wisconsin and Minnesota, but then all of a sudden there was an application into the Alameda County Planning and Zoning to open a frac sand mine, and that got people motivated really quick to speak out. So, yeah.
In this month's Iowa Outdoors magazine, there's an article about wildflowers, but something that pertains to this is they talk about red cedars that date to 200 years, some of which date to 500 years
Yeah.
old. Do you see those at the top of the bluffs, and how do you manage those in your plan?
Yeah. I have a really sad story about a really old cedar tree on that hill prairie. I'll see if I can go back quick. Actually, it's probably about where I'm standing right here when I took this photo. You can see the hill prairie down below. I mean, you can see the cedar skeletons and so forth. But right where I'm standing, there is, okay, so you can see that dark line of cedars right along that rim. So there's kind of a rock bluff at the top of that prairie, and on top of that rock bluff, there's all these old, gnarly cedar trees. And we're basically letting them just be there because they were there. The bad experience I had, when we burned, so we did this fire over here, and then the next year we actually did a fire over here. And we had cut a lot of those cedar trees, and that is such a long slope and it's so steep, we couldn't drag them down, or we'd get like 5 trees done in a day. So we dropped them and bucked them up. And so we had a lot of fuel on that slope. And then right at the top, there were some cedar trees that we just girdled, left them standing, but they were dead and they were dry. When we burned this prairie, we actually lit from the bottom up, and so there was a huge wall of fire going up that hill. And one of the neatest cedar trees on this whole property sits on top of a bluff. It's probably 30 feet up, sitting on top of a rock. There's prairie down below. And after that fire, I came back like 3 weeks later, went out to look at it, and that giant cedar tree is brown. It didn't burn, but it was completely desiccated. And I thought, what just happened? Because there had to be fire on that slope for years to keep it a hill prairie. And if that tree's 400 years old, 500 years old, somebody tried to core it, but the inside of it was so rotten they only got like 200 and some years. How did it never die before? How did my fire kill it? And I had people calling me that were angry. They thought I did it on purpose. I think what happened, one of those trees that we girdled down below the bluff, it came up quite a ways, and that tree burned because the needles were all scorched black. So I know it torched, and I think when it torched, it put so much heat on that cedar, it killed it. And so it was one of the most sick feelings I've ever had. But so I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but basically those ones that we feel are really old, or even on the slope here, there are big rock outcrops on the slope. And if that cedar tree is right on top of a rock, we're leaving it. And we're kind of going to let fire figure out should it be there or not. But we're not actively cutting those really cool and appear to be old cedars. So, and some of them along that bluff top, I think we're going to go in and start taking out some of the hardwood trees that are starting to grow over them and starting to shade them, just to kind of keep them going. So, any other questions?
Is your long-range plan just to keep working on those bluff prairies and gradually getting as much cedar out as you can, and this sort of thing? Are there any, I guess the 2 questions then, are there any private owners who are trying to do that too, or not?
Yes. Yes and yes. So I should have put in a 1930s aerial photo of this property, but
Make you cry.
this let me go back. This one. Okay, this hill prairie in the 1930s and even 1950s aerial photo, this hill prairie went off this photo. It was way over here, and it went way over here. It was easily triple the size that it is right now. That's like 60 years ago. And so these things change fast. And it's not just cedar trees that are taking it over. I mean, there's a lot of like walnut and elms and aspen in there too, obviously. But I think, what we're trying to do first, Daryl, is where there's still good prairie, we're trying to get that opened up first, to try and save that. And then as we have time, we'll start pushing it back. But we're kind of using fire to help push that back instead of just trying to go in there and hand cut everything. So like this burn, you can't really see it, but this burn came all the way down here to the river, and then it went up. So this woodland area, we burned that too in an effort to keep trying to push it back. There are private landowners that are actively doing hill prairie restoration work as well. The DNR is promoting it with cost share programs they have, and NRCS even has some cost share programs. So yeah, I'm starting to see more of it, and I get really excited when I drive by a hill prairie and I see a bunch of cedar trees laying down. So.
Because it is depressing when you drive around northeast Iowa and you look up there and all you see is this cedar groves where you know there was prairie there.
Yeah.
Not that long ago, like you say.
Yeah. Yeah.
I told my husband we used to have contests to roll rocks from the top. See how far we could roll a rock. You know, I mean, they go way down into the cornfield in the upper Iowa Valley. And now you make it about 2 feet, you can hit a tree.
Was it rocks or tires?
No.
Because some moron rolls tires down this hill and they all end up at the base of the hill or in the river. Ah, it makes me mad. It wasn't you guys though. Okay, all right. Yeah.
Do people ever contact you about looking to purchase land? Like you guys acting as a venue to connect folks with similar conservation interests?
Yeah. Yeah, we actually have, what we kind of call a conservation buyer list. So if there's a property that comes up for sale that, let's say, one of the public agencies really isn't interested in for whatever reason, we may feel that it's important enough to protect, and we may buy it and then try and resell it privately, subject to a conservation easement to try and make sure there's permanent protection on it. And so if there's a situation like that, we may call some of those folks and say, hey, here's a property you might be interested in. Sometimes we won't even buy it. I mean, if it's the right individual, you're not too worried about what they're going to do with it.
Like
And
Michael Holster home?
yeah, yeah. So,
You want to talk a little bit about inspecting your existing conservation easements? Don't you need to kind of go and check occasionally to make sure that these are being followed?
Yeah. So there are all sorts of IRS rules that play into conservation easements because most people are getting a tax deduction for doing them. So IRS requires that you monitor and enforce the terms of the easement forever. And that can be a burden too. But our monitoring is we go out on the land once a year. And we just walk the property and make sure there are no violations. If there's a violation, we try and work it out with the landowner. If that doesn't work, then we're hiring attorneys to do it. But yeah, we've had very few violations, and I think it's because we end up having really good relationships with these landowners, and it's a lot of fun just to go out there and walk around and not work.
What's a typical violation?
A typical violation would be, it's a really good question.
Too many animals?
What's that?
Too many
Livestock?
We have some easements that allow grazing and there's restrictions on it, but not a lot. I would say it's maybe if they have a building envelope and pretty soon they start mowing further out, and all of a sudden they put a garden or they'll put up a little shed. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
And so you'll have to say, yeah, you got too far out, you need to move it back in. And sometimes it's dumping, and it's not the landowner. So you can imagine, northeast Iowa, everybody throws their trash in the garbage, or in the ditch, it seems like. And, our relationship is with the landowner. And if they're dumping, no matter who's dumping trash, it needs to be picked up. So, I mean, it can be something as simple as that. Yeah.
Well, that brings up another question about survey.
Uh-huh.
Getting absolute certainty of your property. I mean, that's just a whole crazy area anymore with new technology and fence lines and determining boundaries. What do you do about that?
We just had a situation like that on a conservation easement in Jackson County where we did the conservation easement on the legal description of the property. We didn't have it surveyed. Well, part of the property is across the North Fork of the Maquoketa River, and it's hard to get to. And, the neighbor next to that all of a sudden claimed, hey, part of that's mine. And anyway, long story short, it went to court, and they negotiated, and I don't know how many acres the landowner lost, but they lost like 1 or 2 acres out of maybe 15. He was looking at losing like 10. And so in the end, it ended up being pretty good. But yeah, there was a whole battle over, what was surveyed, what were all these crazy fences, and was that the boundary?
Got so high, now it's a big deal. When land was cheap,
You nailed it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now it's big money.
Yep. Every acre somebody can gain, it's
Yeah.
worth fighting for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That's the not fun part of the job.